Today's PowerPoint is going to be focusing on the experience primarily of immigrants and what happened once they came to the United States, primarily into the big cities here in the United States, looking for those industrial jobs that had been created during the Gilded Age. And primarily, these groups were from South and Eastern Europe, so countries like Italy, some of the former Soviet Union countries like Romania, the Ukraine, even Russia itself. On the West Coast, a lot of immigrants were coming from Japan and China. And it was the experience of these immigrants once they came here that provides us yet another look at what happened as a result of the kind of mass development that happened during the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. It's interesting often that immigration becomes an issue in the United States because we are actually a country of immigrants. And one of the things that we notice right away when we study this period and this group of people during this time is the reaction by the people who were already here. Well, who was already here? Primarily in American cities, they were what were often referred to as the old immigrants. These are people that had descendants clear back from the American Revolution. These are immigrants primarily from England and Western and Northern Europe. And one of the big concerns that these old immigrants, the people that were already here, and of course we're talking primarily about the Euro-Americans that were here, white Americans that were already here. Their concerns about the new groups coming to the United States stem from the fact that a lot of these people were not necessarily Protestant Christian. They were not necessarily literate. They were not necessarily people who possessed a great amount of wealth already. And so the worry was, what were they going to do once they got here? This developed into a whole move of how to treat immigrants. Where were they going to be allowed to come through? How were they going to, be integrated into the United States? And one of the things that was done was to design a place, especially on the East Coast, for them to come through. And that was, of course, Ellis Island, the other small island right next to the island where the Statue of Liberty was built in the 1880s. And as a result, what ended up happening was most immigrants that came through the East Coast, so this is through New York, the New England area of the United States, a very large majority of them would end up coming through this part of the United States, Ellis Island. And of course, the picture you see down below is of course the symbol that a lot of them saw when they first entered New York Harbor, which is of course the Statue of Liberty. And for many of them it was a symbol. It was a symbol that they were arriving here in the United States. And that was a big moment for a lot of these people. It's interesting, the political cartoon you see up above with a bunch of these rich folks, and yet their descendants were immigrants too, and yet they are kind of looking down on these quote-unquote new immigrants. Primarily, these groups were made up of what you see in the slide here: Greek, Italian, Polish, Slovak, Serb, Russian, and Croat ancestry. Now, some of you are wondering, well, where are those countries? Primarily what you're looking at are Southern European countries in and around the Mediterranean, and also Eastern European countries, those countries that are kind of right next door to Russia, including Russia itself. Now, because of that, a lot of these people were not necessarily Protestant Christians. Sometimes they were Orthodox, Eastern or Russian Orthodox, or Catholic. Now, unfortunately, this brought to the United States some old, bitter differences between those cultures. And unfortunately, the difference between various Christian denominations ended up being a pretty bad cultural dividing line between some of these groups. And then, of course, on the West Coast, you had those of Japanese and Chinese descent coming into the big cities like Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and, of course, probably the biggest one of them all, and that was San Francisco. One of the first big challenges was to make sure that these groups could speak English. The United States was not a metropolitan country, and there was a very big insistence on the part of local governments and the federal government that if you came to the United States, you had to speak English. And if they weren't literate in English, they should be at least literate in their own language. In fact, those that came through Ellis Island, just outside of New York, one of the things that people had to prove was that they had to prove that they were in fact literate in some language. And so what the people on Ellis Island did was they very methodically went through and they actually wrote Bible verses and quotes from famous Americans in other languages, and then gave it to people coming from those various countries to make sure that they could at least read in their own language if they couldn't read in English. One of the other big differences that these people had when they came to the United States is they did not come from countries that had democratic republics like the United States. These were not people who were used to being able to participate or even needing to participate in local, civil, and even federal governments. And those were things that needed to be taught to these people as well. As new immigrants started coming to the United States, there had to be some place for them to go. Now, immediately where many of these immigrants went to is they went to the big cities. These cities were already growing and very overcrowded with people. And something you may have remembered from the Industrial Revolution was how overcrowded cities became. And American cities were no different. And in fact, especially in New York, in the Lower East Side, something you're going to see a little video clip of this week. And that was what the experience was for Americans, for new Americans coming to this country, wanting to be a part of the opportunities that were here and what they were willing to endure in order to take part in what was America. And one of the things that they had to endure was something called tenement housing. These were very, very, very small and cramped living quarters. Think of an apartment with no running water. Very few actually had electric lights. And you have families literally crammed into them to where, people are sleeping on floors, they're sleeping on tables turned upside down, and living in very, very cramped and very unhealthy situations. This was primarily because the wages for the jobs that these immigrants could get were very low. It's interesting that we're seeing that today as well. People coming to this country wanting to work, wanting a chance to have a part of the American dream, and yet it's very hard to procure a job that's going to give you that American dream. Well, the immigrants during the Gilded Age found this the case too. We're seeing them struggle very hard with jobs that pay very little to live as well as they possibly could. Now, tenement housing brought with it a number of problems that we're going to look at here in a little bit. These so-called birds of passage simply earn enough income to send to their families and return to their former lives. And that was actually the case in some people, and we're seeing that today too. People earn just enough money to get by. They may even return to their old countries, but at this point in American history, people toughed it out and they figured out what it took what it was needed to make it here in the United States, even as tough as they had it. Now, unfortunately, just as we are seeing today, there were those amongst those that were already here that didn't like this new wave of immigration. And there were a lot of attempts to limit the immigrants coming here in the United States. From roughly the late 1870s all the way to the early 1900s, over 14 million people came to this country. It was the single largest voluntary mass migration of people to any one area we'd ever seen in history. And that was because the promise of America was very bright. And that was thanks in part to the opportunities created by the big industrial titans of the time. We can say that, how they got those big businesses like Carnegie and Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. The things they did were in some cases downright underhanded, but the opportunities they created were undeniable and were very, very attractive to people who had no such opportunities like that in their home countries, in what was often referred to as the Old World. However, even once they started coming here, there were those that did not welcome them and did not want them here. There were those that stood right along those old religious grounds that said that those that were, not of those ethnicities and those nationalities that came from Protestant countries, they didn't want them welcome. This included Catholics and Jews. Nativists, as they were called, reserved special hatred for Chinese immigrants. And by 1882, laws are being passed to actually limit the immigration of people from the Far East, even though these people had been the ones to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They had been the ones to help build various other civil projects throughout the West, such as the railroads leading throughout the West, the Golden Gate Bridge, so on and so forth. The idea that these people were from other nations and were from cultures that were different than from those that were here made them targets of outright racism and bigotry, and as a result, in some cases, there were laws passed to try and keep them from coming. Now, in a much more controlled and legal environment, this took the form of actual immigration laws, which essentially established a quota system, saying that the United States would only allow certain numbers of immigrants from each country into the United States per country. And so, within a given year, only so many people would be allowed from individual countries. And once that number was full, they wouldn't allow any more in. Throughout the early 1900s, these laws slowly restricted more and more and more the flow of immigrants into the United States. The cap that they used was based on immigration numbers starting around 1890. Now, we often wonder, well, when did this, mass migration stop, Mr. Amos? You said it stopped, somewhere in the early 1900s, and that's true. There were two things, well, actually one, that primarily ended the immigration movement during that time coming into the United States, and that was the First World War. The First World War effectively put an end to that mass migration. So if you're wondering, well, what happened to Ellis Island? Well, over the years, Ellis Island got turned into a number of different things. It was changed into a military base during both world wars. Eventually, throughout the late 60s and 70s, it was abandoned. It was actually left completely abandoned until the late 1970s, early 1980s, where it finally was established as a museum. And of course, today, if you ever venture to the East Coast, you can visit Ellis Island and see what it's like. Ellis Island really was an amazing place for immigrants to come through. Because it was so important for immigrants also to not have any kind of communicable diseases, Ellis Island actually became the home of some of the best medical knowledge at the time, and also best medical facilities at the time. Women who were pregnant could wait on Ellis Island to have their child, and of course their child would be American born. That really wasn't an issue back then. Interesting that it is now. And if you were ill and it was a disease that could be cured at the time, you could receive treatment and then be allowed to come into the United States. There were those diseases and there were those medical conditions that would unfortunately earn you a ticket back to the country you came from. And one of those was often mental disease or other kinds of mental conditions that weren't seen as really curable. Now, once these immigrants actually were able to come into the United States, as we mentioned, oftentimes in the big cities, they found themselves having to live in tenement housing. One of the real bad things about tenement housing was the fact that you have people in such close proximity to one another. In other words, they live very closely to one another, literally almost on top of each other. In a lot of these very dark, dank kind of apartments. I mean, we think of, cheap government housing as being kind of a little dodgy. It really was almost a five-star hotel compared to some of these tenement houses, which, I mean, imagine a house where you don't have any windows. You don't have any, hot water or indoor plumbing, no indoor bathrooms. You have an outhouse that's out in the alley somewhere. What you have here in this picture here is a pretty good idea of what it was like. Another thing, unfortunately, that also was the case in these tenement housing was disease. These people may have been able to be cured and be nursed back to health once they got to the country, thanks to the medical facilities at Ellis Island. But once they got into these tenement housing, when you have people living in very close, cramped quarters, unfortunately, that is also breeding ground for disease, and the result, of course, of which is things like the spread of diseases like cholera or yellow fever or any one of a number of bacterial diseases that's caused not only by people living very close to one another, but also very poor sanitation. Something that you guys may have learned last year when looking at the Industrial Revolution was cities like London didn't have adequate sewage systems, and therefore the cities couldn't be clean. So therefore, where did the human waste go? Literally right into the middle of the street. This is still a time when people were still using horses. Well, where did all the horse manure go? Actually, it literally was piles of it sitting in the middle of the street. And of course, all of that with standing water can breed disease. And this often was the case. You guys are going to see in a short video this week about what it was like living in tenement housing and what people started to do to try and clean it up. This quickly became an issue that needed to be addressed in many local cities that were experiencing these kinds of problems with immigrants coming in and what to do about them. Another serious issue, as we looked at in the previous slide, was the spread of not only disease but unsanitary conditions. These were the results of areas of the city that were already overcrowded and now are even piling in more people. And this actually came to be a serious issue amongst a lot of cities, because those diseases would not stay in those local areas. They would spread to areas even where that kind of sanitation problem wasn't an issue. And so quickly cities had to try and figure out ways of dealing with just basic sanitation for these parts where immigrants were coming into. And the interesting thing about this was the cities in the United States that experienced these issues were no different than cities around the world that were kind of the result of industrial expansion beyond the point where people really were able to take care of the people coming into these cities. It's like, oh yeah, come on in. We've got jobs for you. Where are we going to live? Well, we'll figure that out later. How am I going to be able to go to the bathroom and take a shower, clean my clothes, feed my children? Yeah, we'll take care of that later. Well, later came, stayed, and left. And by the time the issues were critical importance, many people had really suffered. And this really kind of leads eventually to what we're going to be looking at in our next PowerPoint, often referred to as the progressive movement. When we start looking at the effect of the Industrial Revolution on people like workers, immigrant workers in the big cities, unfortunately not so much Native Americans that we looked at in our previous PowerPoint, but we also look at what happens with farmers who were who were having a lot of trouble trying to pay their debts and be able to manage during this time because of various depressions that occurred during this time. This really is the prompting that eventually starts what becomes known as the modern American progressive movement. And that's something that we're going to be looking at in our next and actual final PowerPoint for this unit, and that'll be coming up later this week. All right, folks, at this time, go ahead and start looking at your summary paragraphs here. Of course, the really big focus on today's PowerPoint was social change. What had happened with people during this time? And of course, the people that we were primarily focusing on today were, of course, immigrants coming into the United States, primarily from South and Eastern Europe, and of course, coming in on the West Coast, you had people coming in from the Far East, such as China and Japan. So take a look at the notes from today, and be sure you finish up your summary paragraphs for today's notes.